Today on Tiny Voices, we're going to look at how much good sound design can accomplish. That and more today on Tiny Voices. We know that good level design consists of a lot of different elements: enemy placement, layout, environmental storytelling, visual cues which direct your attention to focal points such as set pieces or means to progress in the story. All of these things that I just mentioned are visual or spatial elements though, and we already give them ample consideration when talking about level design. Less often appreciated is the audio landscape that makes a level sonically distinct. A level's soundscape can be both ambient and informative. While the music and the ambient noise set the atmosphere of the level, stir emotions within the player, and make the level itself feel alive, other audio cues can alert you to details, they can get you to look where the developers want your attention focused at, and they can even misdirect you to set up ambushes. The audio and visual landscape of a level work in concert with one another. But because audio can be so much more subtle, it's often less appreciated. The auditory landscape for maps and levels are often just as meticulously constructed as the visible layout, even if the effort is more subtle. Players have to be able to group sounds from one source and segregate sounds from another. The process of doing this is called auditory scene analysis. It's the process by which your brain can pick apart the individual sounds of, say, a woodpecker beating its beak against a tree, and it can segregate that from the sound of a cicada chirping in the summer and from the sound of nearby traffic. Your brain is taking advantage of certain Gestalt principles to assure that you don't hear all of this as one big cacophony. In a video game, though, that has to be designed for. Overwatch, for instance, doesn't use mid-match music to avoid muddying up the game's soundscape. Sound is a strategic resource in Overwatch, and thus the audio design has to be clean enough to reflect that. For instance, you can glean a lot about the movements of your opponents just by the individual pitter-patter of their footsteps. How the sound reflects, absorbs, and diffracts off of different surfaces tells you a wealth of information about who is moving and where. Not only is the positional audio very good, but characters of different weights and carrying different pieces of equipment and armor make different noises signaling who it is who's moving near you. You can always differentiate the sound of Roadhog nearby by the sound of his chain rattling when he walks around. You can differentiate Reinhardt by the big, clunking, heavy footsteps he makes. If I hear much lighter footsteps coming around a corner that I'm guarding, and the enemy team has both a Reinhardt and a Roadhog, then that makes me reasonably sure that whoever is moving near me must be one of their lighter, squishier characters, probably a support like the Ana, the Lucio, or in this case, a Genji. Sound is a strategic resource in Overwatch, and thus the audio design has to be clean enough to reflect that. Michael Thieler, an audio engineer who worked on Banner Saga, created ambient sound for the game that didn't distract from informative sounds by paying careful attention to the repetition and timing in his soundscape, in his mix, and manipulated the ambient sound's frequencies to make sure that they never blended in with the more important informative game audio. He says, "Usually the frequencies I'm concerned with are the middle frequencies from around 350 Hz to around 2000 kHz. This varies of course, and I will have already chosen audio that doesn't contain important information that is loud and overbearing in these frequencies. Also, I'm talking by degrees. Everything has these frequencies in them to an extent. I just ensure that they're not overwhelming or distracting in any way." What you often hear in horror and more heavily atmospheric games are blended, non-melodic effects and music used to unsettle you. And it works because if done right, it's difficult to segregate individual elements and correctly analyze the scene. Noises don't always make logical sense, and they can't always clearly be discerned from one another, which gives them an unnerving quality. And of course, the other major role that sound plays in games is an informative one. In Warcraft 3, for instance, you get audible alerts accompanying flashes of text when important events occur, like an upgrade completing, or your base being under attack, or you being unable to place a structure down on certain sets of terrain.
More gold is required. Our forces are under attack. I cannot summon there. Research complete.
This way you get twice as much sensory input to reinforce the gravity of an alert. The audio callouts also mean that there are less things on screen that you have to be looking at while you multitask. In Bioshock, before you pick up your first progression-based plasmid, the jingle for the Gatherer's Garden where you get it guides you up the stairs to the vending machine. Shortly thereafter in a cutscene, Big Daddies are introduced alongside their distinctive groan, so that when later in the game you hear them bellowing through a door or through a wall, you feel an immediate sense of danger even before the Big Daddy is present in the same room as you. You've already been primed to react to that sound. Before, I alluded to horror devs using sound to misdirect you so you're more susceptible to ambushes, and to just plain startle you with jump scares. Think of how wildly different Dead Space would be without its brilliant audio design. You're under a persistent threat if the audio is to be believed. In every direction there's the sound of steam hissing or something crawling through a vent, and sometimes the noise will play just behind you to get you to turn around so that when you turn back around again, there's a necromorph right in your face. And in the midst of combat, because the positional audio is so good, you can hear necromorphs flooding in from another corner of the room while you're preoccupied with one directly in front of you. So as long as you're paying careful attention, these ambushes don't feel too cheap. There's even a horror game called Deep Sea, which is an entirely blind experience. Players strap on what looks like a modified gas mask and put a pair of headphones on and have to navigate around some lurking deep sea monster using only audio feedback. And if you want further evidence of how important sounds are to a game's level design and how meticulously sound designers apply their craft, look no further than Mike Tyson's Punchout, which has been successfully speedrun blindfolded, or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which has been beaten over the course of 5 years by a completely blind YouTuber. Sound design and its ocean of subtleties aren't as appreciated as the visual and spatial elements that comprise level design, but where sounds are placed, when they're triggered, and how well they ebb and flow together are just as important in the construction of a level. Just try playing a game with all the sounds turned off and see how flat and directionless it feels by comparison. That's gonna do it for this week's Tiny Voices. Next week, we're gonna be looking at motion sickness in virtual reality. That and more next week on Tiny Voices.